At my son's wedding, his bride introduced me as the family joke who never achieved anything. The whole room laughed until her father turned pale and said, "You mean the woman who secretly bought out my entire family business?" My name is Clarraine, and before I take you into this story, I want to pause for a moment and ask you, where are you watching from today? Are you in the comfort of your living room? Perhaps sipping a cup of tea? Or maybe you're far away, tuning in late at night, when the world around you is asleep. Wherever you are, I welcome you. This is not just a story about me. It's a story about patience, dignity, and the strength people often overlook. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I was never the woman people expected much from. I married young, as most girls in my town did back then. My husband was ambitious, full of fire and pride. He always believed he was destined for greatness. And well, I was expected to play my role quietly, cook the meals, raise the child, keep the house in order, smile when company came over. And for a long time, I did exactly that. But silence is a strange thing. It has its own way of sharpening the mind. When you are silent long enough, you begin to notice details that others miss. The way a businessman glances nervously when debt is mentioned. The subtle tremor in a voice that boasts too loudly. The cracks in conversations that reveal more than intended. I became an observer of life, because no one ever thought I had anything to contribute. My husband, bless him, was not unkind, but he was dismissive. He loved our son dearly, but when it came to me, he often brushed aside my opinions as though they were dust on the windowsill. If I suggested saving more for the future, he would laugh and say, "Leave the numbers to me, Clarraine. You just take care of the house." When I hinted at wanting to continue my education, he chuckled, "Books won't put food on the table." I remember once, sitting by the window with a candle burning low, flipping through a borrowed accounting book. He walked in and shook his head. "You? Reading about finance? You'll give yourself a headache. Better to knit or bake." And so, to him, I was just that, the wife who baked, the mother who cared, the woman who smiled politely. But I held on to that book, and many others after it. You see, while the world saw me as plain and unremarkable, inside I carried questions. I wanted to know how money moved, how businesses rose and fell, and why the same families who looked down on me so easily were often drowning in their own pride. So, I learned quietly, slowly, patiently. At first it was just numbers. Later it became investments, shares, and the language of commerce itself. Meanwhile, my days went on as expected. I raised my son with every ounce of love I had. He was my joy, my pride, the very reason I endured everything else. I made sure his clothes were neat, his school books covered, his meals warm, and his confidence strong. He never knew that while he slept, I was poring over ledgers by candlelight. There were times I longed for someone to see me, not as a wife or a mother, but as a woman with dreams of her own. But recognition never came. At family gatherings, I was always the quiet one at the corner. My husband's relatives would speak loudly of their business deals, their lands, their connections. And when the laughter turned my way, it was never out of respect. I was invisible, or worse, the subject of mockery. Yet invisibility has its uses. When no one expects anything of you, they never guard themselves around you. They speak freely, dismiss you, underestimate you, and in their underestimation, they reveal truths they should have kept hidden. I began to see opportunity where others only saw emptiness. Every insult I endured, every laugh at my expense, every patronizing pat on the hand, it all became fuel. I would smile, nod, and excuse myself politely, but inside I would whisper, "You will not see me coming." Life is a long road, my dear friends, and while many rush down it, eager to show off their strength, I chose to walk it quietly, placing one careful step after another. Little did they know, those steps were leading me towards something far greater than they could ever imagine. It was in those silent years, as the world looked right through me, that I began to plant the seeds of my greatest secret. The turning point in my life came not with a grand announcement, but with something far quieter, an overheard conversation. My husband's relatives had ties to a family far wealthier than ours. They owned a business, the kind people whispered about with admiration and envy. The name carried weight in the community, and they flaunted it like a crown. It was into this family that my son's future bride was born, though back then she was still a girl, and the marriage nothing more than a spoken promise between parents. Whenever these people visited, I was expected to serve tea, refill plates, and stand politely in the background. They never looked at me directly, never asked me questions. I might as well have been the wallpaper. And yet, from my quiet post at the side of the room, I saw and heard everything. It was during one such evening, as the men discussed their business ventures after supper, that I caught the first cracks in their golden image. One brother muttered about accounts not balancing. Another spoke too freely after a few glasses of wine, mentioning debts and creditors. The eldest snapped at them, warning not to let the women overhear. They laughed, and the conversation shifted. But I had already tucked the words away. From that night onward, I began listening more carefully. Each visit revealed more. There were disputes among them, rivalries hidden beneath smiles, and whispers of deals gone wrong. I watched how their confidence slipped the moment money troubles were mentioned. Their empire, it seemed, was not as untouchable as it looked. That discovery lit a fire inside me. I realized that knowledge was power, and I could gather it without anyone suspecting. While my husband busied himself with appearances, I quietly began to expand my education. Not in classrooms, of course. Those doors were never meant to open for me. Instead, I found my way to the back corners of libraries, borrowing old manuals on commerce and ledgers. I befriended clerks and accountants, offering baked goods in exchange for conversations about their work. And, at night, I studied until the candle wax dripped low. At first, it was overwhelming. Balance sheets, profit margins, dividends, they were words spoken in a foreign tongue. But as with any language, persistence cracked the code. Slowly I understood. And with understanding came courage. I began experimenting, cautiously at first. I took a small portion of the housekeeping money, just a sliver, and invested it in modest shares of a company no one paid attention to. Weeks turned into months, and while the amount was small, the returns were steady. With every gain, I grew bolder. Soon I wasn't just dabbling, I was building. The more I studied, the clearer it became. The wealthy family tied to us by marriage was bleeding money through arrogance. They expanded too quickly, spent without care, and treated their workers poorly. Pride had blinded them, and I knew pride was always the sharpest blade of downfall. But I wasn't reckless. I never spoke of my growing knowledge. Not to my husband, not even to my son. To them, I was still the same Clarraine. Quiet, dependable, unremarkable. That was my disguise, and it served me well. I remember one particular evening vividly. A gathering had been held at their grand home, chandeliers glittering above, laughter echoing through gilded halls. I stood in the corner, as usual, pouring tea. Their eldest son bragged about a new expansion, but I caught the way the daughter-in-law clenched her jaw, the way the father's smile strained at the edges. I knew then that behind the laughter lay panic, and I knew, too, that one day I would hold the strings of their collapsing empire. It wasn't greed that pushed me forward. It was necessity. I had lived long enough under the weight of others' judgments, laughed at and dismissed. But I wasn't doing this to prove a point to them. No, I was doing it for my son. I wanted him to have a life where no one could look down on him, a life shielded from the cruelty I endured. And so, I kept collecting. Small shares, hidden partnerships, quiet favors. Every piece added to my unseen puzzle. I smiled politely at the family dinners, nodded at their mocking jokes, and then, behind closed doors, I tightened my grip on their future. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was nothing. And that, dear friends, became my greatest weapon. For invisibility gave me the freedom to move unseen, to learn unnoticed, and to prepare for the day when the tables would finally turn. By the time my son was nearly grown, my little experiments had become something far more. I had already built the foundation of an empire in shadows, one that would, in time, swallow theirs whole. The years slipped by, each one layering another coat of invisibility over me. On the surface, nothing changed. I was still the quiet wife who prepared meals, ironed shirts, and greeted guests at the door. But beneath that surface, my world was shifting, brick by brick, stone by stone. My little experiments with shares had grown into something far more deliberate. At first, I had only dabbled, watching cautiously as my savings ebbed and flowed. But after those early successes, I realized I could play the long game. I began acquiring small stakes in businesses connected to the wealthy family, the very empire my son's future in-laws controlled. Of course, I could never buy directly. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, I worked through trusted intermediaries, old friends, clerks who owed me favors, and even distant cousins who barely remembered my name. Every share I purchased was tucked away under someone else's hand, but always with the binding understanding that it was mine in truth. It was delicate work, requiring patience and trust, but I had patience in abundance. What I lacked in visibility, I made up for in endurance. For years, I endured mockery. At family gatherings, my in-laws and their business associates often laughed at my silence. "Clarraine, why are you always so quiet?" They would chuckle. "She doesn't understand these things. Leave her be." Another would add, waving me off as though I were a servant instead of a guest. Once, at a dinner, the bride's uncle leaned across the table and smirked. "You've never worked a day in your life, have you? Just a simple homemaker." The room erupted with laughter, and I felt my cheeks flush hot with shame. I wanted to tell him that while he laughed, I was already holding the keys to his future. But instead, I smiled softly and poured him another glass of wine. Every insult became fuel. Every humiliation became a quiet vow. My husband never suspected. To him, I was simply occupied with hobbies. He would often tease me for my habit of scribbling in notebooks at night. "What are you writing, Clarraine?" "Fairy tales?" I would smile and close the book, never revealing that the fairy tale was a careful record of stocks, bonds, and shifting market prices. Our son grew into a fine young man, bright and respectful. I made sure he never carried the burden of my secret life. He saw only a mother who loved him deeply, who supported him at every turn. He had no idea that while he studied his textbooks, I was studying ledgers, or that while he dreamed of the future, I was quietly building it for him. By the time he was finishing school, my influence stretched wider than I ever dared to. Imagine in those early nights with a borrowed candle. I held silent stakes in factories, warehouses, and shipping routes. Some businesses flourished, others faltered, but I always reinvested wisely. When one door closed, I found another. And then, slowly, something extraordinary happened. Whispers began to circulate. The wealthy family, once so untouchable, was facing unseen hands in their dealings. Investors they thought were loyal began siding with someone else. Contracts slipped through their fingers. Rival bidders appeared at the last moment, armed with information they could not explain. They didn't know it was me. They couldn't even imagine it. I became a shadow presence in their empire, invisible but undeniable. By the time my son reached adulthood, I quietly owned more than half of the shares in their holdings, carefully disguised, meticulously hidden, but mine all the same. Their arrogance had blinded them so completely that they never thought to look in my direction. And yet, despite the growing power in my hands, I remained silent. I didn't brag. I didn't boast. I still smiled politely when they mocked me, still poured tea when asked, still played the role of the unremarkable wife, because I knew the day would come when my silence would break, and when it did, it would not be with whispers or hints. It would be with a thunderclap so loud that it would silence every laugh they had ever dared to aim at me. But until that day, I waited. And in my waiting, I grew stronger. The morning of my son's wedding began with joy. I remember standing before the mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress, my heart swelling with pride. My son, my only child, was stepping into a new chapter of his life. The church bells rang softly outside, their sound mingling with laughter and music drifting through the air. Guests arrived in their finest clothes. Flowers lined the aisles, and the scent of roses filled every corner. For me, it was not just a wedding. It was a culmination of years of sacrifice, patience, and love. I had dreamed of this day, of watching my son smile with happiness as he held the hand of the woman he loved. I sat quietly in the front row, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my emotions steady. My husband beamed proudly, and for once I allowed myself to feel peace. The ceremony was beautiful. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, promises sealed with a kiss. The applause that followed echoed through the hall, warm and thunderous. My son looked radiant, his eyes glistening with love and hope. It was only later, during the reception, that the air shifted. The music played cheerfully, glasses clinked, and speeches were made. Laughter filled the room. Then, as is tradition, the bride began introducing the families to the guests. She spoke warmly of her father, her mother, her brothers. Applause followed each name. And then, with a smile that was both sweet and sharp, she turned to me. "This," she said, gesturing toward me, "is my mother-in-law, the family joke who never achieved anything." The words struck like a blade. For a moment, silence. Then laughter erupted. A wave of chuckles, smirks, and knowing glances rolled through the room. Some laughed awkwardly, others more freely, as though they had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Even the band seemed to falter before picking up again. I felt the weight of every eye upon me. Heat rose in my cheeks. My chest tightened. I forced a smile, the same smile I had worn through countless humiliations before. But inside, something cracked. Not from anger, but from sorrow. After everything, after years of sacrifice, of silent building, of shielding my son from scorn, this was how I was introduced to the world. I looked at my son. His face froze, his eyes darting between me and his new wife. I could see the shame in him, the conflict, the helplessness. He opened his mouth to speak, but the laughter drowned him out. And then, a silence heavier than any laughter fell upon the hall. The bride's father had not laughed. He was staring at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. His hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. The merriment around him died away as people noticed his expression. Finally, in a voice that quivered with disbelief, he said, "You mean the woman who secretly bought out my entire family business?" The laughter stopped instantly. Forks clattered onto plates. The room froze, as though time itself had been suspended. Every head turned toward me. Every mocking smile disappeared, replaced by shock, confusion, even fear. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply sat there, Calm, still, watching the truth ripple through the crowd like a storm rolling in over calm waters. The bride's face drained of colour. She blinked rapidly, glancing at her father, then at me, then back again. What, what do you mean? She stammered. Her father's voice rose, sharp and desperate. Do you not understand? This woman, this woman sitting quietly before you, is the reason our debts were called in, the reason our shares slipped through our fingers, the reason we no longer hold the power we once did. Gasps echoed around the room. Whispers turned into stunned murmurs. People leaned forward in their chairs, straining to hear every word. I kept my silence, my hands folded in my lap, my face serene. For years, I had dreamed of this moment. Not the humiliation, not the laughter, but the silence that followed. The silence when truth shattered illusion. The bride's hand trembled around her wineglass. My son looked at me, bewildered, desperate for answers. My husband sat motionless, his mouth parted in shock. And still, I said nothing, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any voice ever could. That night, as the world stared at me with new eyes, I realized the time for hiding was nearly over. The years of invisibility had served their purpose. Now, they would see me, not as the family joke, not as the unremarkable wife, but as the woman who had quietly rewritten the story of their empire. For a long moment, the hall remained still. The music had stopped. Glasses sat untouched. People leaned in, waiting for me to deny it, to laugh, to say it was a misunderstanding. But I did not. I lifted my gaze slowly, first to my son, then to my husband, and finally to the bride's father. His face was etched with a mixture of fear and rage. Fear because he knew the truth, and rage because he had been outwitted by someone he never considered a threat. Tell them, he demanded, his voice trembling. Tell them what you've done. All eyes turned toward me. My heart beat steadily, not fast, not panicked, steady. For years, I had carried this secret in silence. Now, with the world watching, I chose my words carefully. I did not buy your business in malice, I said softly, my voice carrying across the room. I did it because you left cracks in the foundation. You squandered what you were given. You mocked those who worked quietly. And you never noticed the woman in the corner taking note of every mistake. Gasps followed. The bride's face paled even more. She clutched her father's arm, whispering desperately. But he only shook his head. He knew the truth. I turned to the guests, to the very people who had laughed at me moments earlier. For years, I was invisible. To you, I was the quiet wife, the homemaker, the woman with no ambition. You spoke freely in my presence because you believed I was too simple to understand. But I listened. I learned. And when the time came, I acted. My husband finally found his voice. Clarraine, he whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. All these years. How? I looked at him gently. With patience. With books you told me not to read. With money you thought too small to matter. With a determination you never saw, because you never thought to look. The room murmured again, whispers weaving through the crowd like restless winds. Some stared in awe, others in confusion, a few in shame. I turned back to my son. His eyes were filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something deeper, realization, understanding, pride. Son, I said, my voice breaking for the first time, I did this for you. Every coin I saved, every share I purchased, every risk I took. It was never about me. It was about making sure you would never be at the mercy of people who think silence is weakness. I wanted you to walk into life with dignity, with strength, and with freedom. He rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and crossed the room to me. He took my hands in his and whispered, Mother, I had no idea. His voice trembled, but in it I heard pride blooming. The bride looked stricken, unable to meet my eyes. Only hours earlier she had introduced me as the family joke, the woman who had achieved nothing. Now she sat in silence, her face flushed with humiliation. Her father, though, was less quiet. His fury boiled over, and he slammed his fist onto the table. "You tricked us! You deceived us!" I shook my head. "No, I did not trick you. You deceived yourselves with arrogance. I did nothing but see what you refused to see. I simply took the opportunities you left, lying in the open." The truth hit him harder than any insult could. He had been undone not by a rival tycoon, not by a competitor with armies of advisers, but by a woman he had never bothered to acknowledge. My husband sat stunned, struggling to process it all. For decades he had believed himself the provider, the man of the house. Now he realized his wife had quietly built an empire right beneath his nose. I saw his pride fracture, but I also saw something new, respect, though reluctant, dawning in his eyes. I looked around the hall one last time. You laughed at me because I was quiet. But let me tell you this: silence is not weakness. Silence is observation. Silence is preparation. And when the time is right, silence becomes the loudest voice in the room. The room erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause. Hesitant at first, then stronger, louder, until it filled the hall. Some clapped out of respect, others out of awe, and a few because they realized they had underestimated me all along. The bride lowered her head in shame. My son stood tall beside me, holding my hand tightly. My husband sat quietly, absorbing the truth. And the bride's father, the once proud businessman, looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single moment. That night, the tables had turned completely. I was no longer the invisible woman, the quiet mother, the family joke. I was the punchline they never saw coming. That night changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who had been in that hall. The laughter that once stung me so deeply was gone, replaced by silence, respect, and in some cases, fear. For years I had played the role of the invisible woman, but in that single evening, the veil was lifted. They saw me for who I truly was, not the family joke, but the architect of their downfall, the protector of my son's future. In the days that followed, the whispers spread far beyond the wedding. The story of the silent mother-in-law who had secretly bought out a family empire traveled through neighbors, relatives, and eventually the entire community. Some admired me, some envied me, and a few still resented me. But it didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I didn't need validation. I knew my worth, and so did they. The bride, who once introduced me with that cruel smile, changed her tone quickly. She became quiet in my presence, her arrogance tempered. I did not scorn her, nor did I punish her. She was young, thoughtless, blinded by the pride of her family's name. In time, perhaps she would learn that humility lasts longer than beauty, and respect carries farther than titles. Her father, though, struggled the most. He had built his reputation on power, on dominance, on the illusion of control. To have been undone by the woman he once dismissed as nothing, it was a wound his pride could not easily heal. Yet even he could not deny the truth. In the months after the wedding, I received letters. Stiff, formal letters, acknowledging my ownership and begrudgingly offering cooperation. It was not an apology, but it was as close as his pride would allow. My husband. Ah, my husband. For years he had seen me only as the quiet wife at his side. That night, his image of me shattered. At first he was overwhelmed, even embarrassed. But as the days passed, I saw something in his eyes I had longed for my whole life. Respect. He began asking my opinion, listening more carefully, even apologizing in his own awkward way for dismissing me all those years. We never became equals in his mind. Old habits die hard. But he could no longer look at me without seeing my strength. And my son. He was the one who mattered most. That night, when he stood by my side and took my hand, I felt something greater than pride. I felt peace. For years, I had carried the weight of silence so he could grow without burden. Now he knew. He saw the lengths to which his mother had gone, the battles I had fought in shadows to protect his tomorrow. And in his eyes, I saw gratitude. Not for the wealth, not for the power, but for the love that had driven it all. As for me, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, the nights by candlelight, reading books my husband told me to put away, the whispers I overheard when they thought I wasn't listening, the humiliation I endured at dinners, at gatherings, at every moment I was dismissed. Each wound had been a lesson. Each laugh at my expense had been a stepping stone. And in the end, it was their arrogance, not my ambition, that had paved the way for my victory. I do not tell this story to boast. I tell it because I want you, my dear friends watching, to remember something important. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. Being overlooked does not mean being powerless. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one notices. And more than that, your worth is not determined by the world's laughter. It is determined by what you know you are capable of, even when no one else sees it. To those of you watching from your homes, from your quiet corners of the world, perhaps you too have been underestimated. Perhaps you too have been laughed at, dismissed, overlooked. Let my story be a reminder. You do not need to shout to be heard. You do not need recognition to be valuable. Sometimes, the greatest victories are those won in silence, revealed only when the time is right. As I sit here now, years after that wedding day, I do not think of revenge. I do not think of humiliation. I think of legacy, of the future I secured for my son, of the respect I finally earned, of the quiet power that carried me through. And I think of you, dear listener. Perhaps you are young and impatient. Perhaps you are older, like me, looking back on the road you've walked. Wherever you are, know this. Every step, every choice, every moment of patience has meaning. Even if the world does not see it now, one day your silence may echo louder than any shout. So tell me, where are you watching from today? Because wherever you are, I want you to remember, your story is not over. And perhaps, just like mine, it is only beginning.